Hey all, my name is Lisa Malvin, and I'm the program manager for the professional development programs here at the Graham School. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just some things to know while we do this webinar is you can keep yourself, I'm going to mute you guys all when you get in the room, but just make sure that you're on mute so that we don't cause any issues during the presentation. And then if you don't want to be seen like I'm doing right now, you can just turn off your video and then we won't see you, but you can still see us. And if you have any technical problems while we go through this, I'm always available on chat. So you can always chat at me, you can privately chat me, and I'll try to solve some of your issues as we go through this. I think we're gonna save questions for the end since it's hard to do chat while we're talking, but we'll definitely give you about 10 minutes to ask questions. If you have any questions for me specifically about the program, I'm happy to answer that at the end as well. But I want to kick it off to Tim, who's going to be leading the webinar. He's an alumna of the Project Management Strategy program, so we're really excited about this presentation. So there you go, Tim. It's all for you now.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for the platform to talk about this and to share some ideas with my fellow University of Chicago folks. It's a topic that I'm pretty passionate about, change management. I've been involved for about 4 years, leading that effort within our own organization, and I'm very excited to talk about the integration of change management and project management. So just a little bit about me. I promise it'll be brief. I'm currently the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer for PMA Consultants. I'm a member of the Project Management Institute, a member of the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, a member of the Change Management Professionals Association. I'm a PMP. I'm certified with Pro Sai in both as a change management practitioner and as a train-the-trainer to provide change management training within the organization. And as Lisa mentioned, I'm a very happy alum of the program on project management strategy, which I cannot recommend highly enough. It's I learned so much in a relatively short time, and it was very helpful. So the organization Pro Sai is where I did my studies for change management, and they're an interesting organization because they actually scientifically survey organizations on a biannual basis and figure out through correlation what works and what doesn't work in change management. And so their best practice guides and their processes are all based on real live scientific data versus just thinking what a good approach would be and writing it up. And so they've been evolving over many years with their best practices guide, and they do a survey every 2 years to thousands of corporations around the world on how they do change management and what is effective. And they have this ADKAR model, which is very helpful in thinking about how to organize around change management within the organization. And we're going to come back to this ADKAR later, but just as an initial glide by, when you're going through a change, whether it's a change in your own life or an organizational change, there are these steps which they've identified that you have to get through in order to successfully accomplish change. And the first one is you have to be aware that there's a need for change. You have to desire that change. You have to have the knowledge on how to change and the ability to implement that change in behavior. And then it needs to be reinforced over time. So any one of those areas can be a block that needs to be addressed, and they have diagnostic tools with Pro Sai so that you can figure out where in your process you might be blocked, either organizationally or individually. And as we'll see later, every organizational change is actually made up of individuals changing. So we'll go through that. So one of the most compelling things I've seen on change management is this idea from a McKinsey study. Probably everybody's familiar with the consulting firm McKinsey, but they're pretty rigorous. And back in 2002, they examined 40 projects. They evaluated the expected ROI, the actual ROI from the project, and the level of change management effectiveness. And they judged that by 3 factors: how effective were the senior managers, the middle managers, and the frontline staff in executing on change management. The results are pretty astounding. There's a very high correlation between having good change management and getting a lot of ROI out of your projects. So you can see on the right bottom part of the slide that if people were above average in all 3, senior managers, middle managers, and frontline, they realized an average of 143% of the expected value of the project. Whereas if they were below average on all 3 factors, they realized only 35% of the expected value. And so part of the reason that I'm excited about change management is because we undertake projects for a business reason. And in order to get the most benefit out of a project, we need to engage individuals. It can't just be served up to them without a proper communications plan and structure and support from the organization. So there's another correlation analysis where you can see the impact of improving the change management effectiveness of your organization. If you look at the graph on the right, you can see that if you have poor change management practices, then 16% of your projects will meet their objectives. Whereas if you just go from poor to good, you get a huge boost up to 77%. And excellent change management is drives you up to a 96% result. In my role in project management over the years, I have noticed that many projects do not meet their original objectives. And I think that implementing change management has made a big difference for us in the way that we approach projects and in the success that we've seen. So how do we align change management with project management? You can see that project management has individual processes, initiation and contract management, and those are all kind of technical. Are we on schedule? Are we on budget? What's our earned value? Those are questions of a technical nature. In change management, the questions are different. They are, is this person on board? Do they have the skills needed to execute this change? If the person isn't on board or we're getting resistance, how are we going to manage that resistance? What's our communication plan for change? Who's our executive sponsor for this change? So while they are running in parallel, they're very different, the people side versus the technical side of approaching project management for success. Organizations typically go through, always go through 3 states when involved in a large change or even a small change. For instance, implementing a new ERP system or CRM system, that would be a project that would require change in the organization, change in processes, maybe changes in staffing, training. And so we have our current state. This is how things are done today. The transition state, which is very important and I think oftentimes overlooked in the process of trying to manage change, and then the future state. Now, the transition state is really important because, just as an example, if you were implementing a CRM system, you have some way of tracking customer relationship information now, and in the future you're going to have this new CRM system. But someplace in between, there's going to have to be a process whereby you move from the old system to the new system, or they run in parallel. And you have to ensure that everybody in the organization who's going to be affected by a change has that transition state worked out and are capable of going through the transition state. Many people get stalled in the transition state and projects fail. Now, this is one of the best insights that I got out of my Pro Sai training, and I had never thought of it in this way before, but you know, in change management, the organization is changing. Something's changing in the organization. People are being impacted. But what I hadn't thought of is that really every single individual involved in a change has to go through this process, this three-step process for themselves. How do I do my job today? How do I transition to this new state? And how do I do my job afterwards? And that insight that you have to have everybody on board in order to really get the change, the kind of ROI you want for your project. And so this next slide kind of illustrates that, I mean, imagine that 2/3 of these people never got off the current state. Well, your project is not going to be successful. So what is your plan for moving people, individual people, from the current state through the transition state into the future state? And one of the tools that Pro Sai has that helps with this is to put together a coalition map that shows within your organization, from the top down, from your executive sponsor down, who's going to be affected by this change. And then it actually diagnoses, this individual is against the change, vocally not in favor of it. Okay, what are we going to do about that? We have to go talk to that person's manager. They have to work with them. Some people are really effective at change management. Other people may not be. And we also rank each individual leader's ability to affect change. So we can help people through the process, but remember, it goes back to every single person that's going to be affected. And that was a big eye-opener for me. And I think it would have improved many projects in the past for me if I had known this information back then. So change management, as Pro Sai practices it, is very positive. It's interested in helping individuals through that journey. And the professionalism and best practices that they bring to that are very helpful in moving folks from the current state through the future state. Each individual has to be supported in their own way, depending on where they currently are on the spectrum of understanding what change needs to happen, having the tools to make that change happen. Within a large organization, probably the toughest position is a middle manager. And middle manager is going to get people rebelling from underneath them if they don't like the change, and they're going to be under pressure from their leadership to make the change happen. And so as you're considering change management planning and putting a team together, you should really take the time to think about your middle managers and helping them and supporting them. They're a critical aspect of this overall process. So getting back to that 5 building blocks, we're going to go through those in a little bit more detail. You move through each of these steps, and if you're blocked at any one of the steps, you need to address that before you can move on. So you can't just move from awareness to knowledge. You have to move through the desire. You have to get through that. Yes, I do want to make this change. I'm in favor of the change. And you can imagine if someone isn't even aware that a change needs to be made, they're going to be pretty frustrated if you tell them change is happening. People don't like change for the most part. It needs to be managed to help them through it. And one of the things I learned in my classes was that there's a reverse correlation between people's awareness and the amount of resistance that you get in change. So the more you help people to understand why the change is needed, what's necessary of them, what's needed from them in this change, then the less resistance you'll get later. There's also a phrase that they use, what's in it for me, with them. And it's an important step in this whole process to figure out for each individual what's in it for them. Now, there are some changes where there's nothing in it for them, and those are the hardest changes. If you're going to close a location or relocate people, that's going to be hard for them to say, well, I see what's in it for me. The organization as a whole obviously needs to make that change, but for some individuals, it's not going to work out well. So, what are some of the steps in actually perform change management? So, we start with phase one, which is you define your change management strategy. There's a change management team that you put together depending on the type of change. If it's a large change that's going to really impact the organization as a whole, there's certain sensitive issues like changing people's pay or people being redeployed or losing their roles with the organization as a whole. Those are big changes, high impact changes. And so depending on the type of change you're making, you need to change your change management team to reflect that. And one of the most critical elements in a successful change management program is your sponsor. It's an executive sponsor, someone who has a lot of clout in the organization. If it's a huge, strategic change for the organization, it's best if it's the CEO who's your executive sponsor. And it's not a matter where they just show up for the announcement and then don't think about it again. They have to stay engaged throughout the entire process and support that change and let the entire organization know that that change is important. Now, when it comes to the impact on individuals, Pro Sai has determined that the best way to deal with individual change is with that person's direct report leader, so that they can sit down with them, preferably, and have a talk and really understand them as a person and help them through this change. In phase two, we talk about managing the change. So very much like executing and controlling in the PMI model, now we're managing the change. The change is underway. We're developing our change management plans, and we're implementing those plans. And there's a whole series of planning processes and plans that you go to create in order to have a successful change. Communication is critical. Obviously, the more you communicate, then the better people feel. Sponsor roadmap. This is where you kind of diagnose the organization and you say, well, we have 6 leaders in this chain and 3 of them are not in favor of the change, and we're going to have to go work on them and get them in favor of the change or move them out of the way. That is one of the toughest spots in change management, one of the most sensitive, where you're trying to determine who's on board and who isn't, but it's a really important step. Put together a training plan. Obviously, you're going to need a gap analysis for what training needs to be accomplished. A coaching plan, especially for middle management folks who are going to need help, and a resistance management plan where you forecast what do we think people are going to, what do we think that the objections will be to this project. Oh, I'm sorry. I was distracted by a chat item. So I'm just going to continue on. And then reinforcing the change is also very important. People have a tendency to slide back into old processes and old habits. And so you need to be vigilant. And the way that you do that is by compliance audits. Are people using this new system or new process the way that we had intended? Corrective action plans if the audit determines that some people are not. And an after action review to talk about what went well and what didn't go well, and then transition management into the kind of O&M phase of the change. So change management is like project management in many ways, but it's the people side. It's individual people. And it's really important to, I know I keep repeating that, but it's so important to see each individual who's going to be affected by this change and really understand where they are in the process and how to help them and support them. And just remember that for every person who doesn't join in on this process change or start using the new software, is resistant, or doesn't show up for the training, that is potentially, very likely, lowering your return on investment. You started this whole process for a reason, and if you don't engage every single person, then you will not get the benefit that you had hoped to out of your process or project. So returning back to the idea of project management and change management working together, this next slide talks about some of the processes in project management and how they align with processes in change management. So for those of you who are familiar with the Project Management Book of Knowledge, the PMBOK, there's initiation, planning, executing and monitoring and control, and closing. The change management side of that would be preparing for the change, managing the change, and reinforcing it. And for individuals, it's that ADKAR 5-step process. They have to go through the awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement in order to make that change effective. Also, comparing the tools that you might use in each. In project management, of course, you need a statement of work, a project charter, a business case, probably a work breakdown structure, depending on the size of the project, budget estimates, resource allocations, schedules, and tracking tools. Probably a project management information system as well. And then on the change management side, the individual change model, where each individual has to go through that ADKAR 5-step. The readiness assessment. This assessment talks about the organization's readiness for change. One of the things that can happen to an organization is if you haven't been good at change management in the past, then you probably have some failed projects in the past. And those failed projects are in the memory, the institutional organizational memory. Individuals will think about those, and it makes successful change harder later on. Also, organizations can have change saturation, where so much is changing so quickly that people can't keep up, and they get disheartened, and they start to withdraw. And you need to pay attention to that as well when you're planning a portfolio of change. How ready is my organization overall for change, and how do I help my organization get on a better footing for change? Coaching plans for leadership, training plans for staff. It may be that some of your leadership needs training in order to be better at change management, which you can do a skills assessment and determine where they stand and then address that issue up front too. Resistance management is a very important part of the process, and it's usually pretty easy to determine resistance. And if you have a resistance management plan, you can have predetermined escalation. So we're going to try this first, and then that, and then the third thing, and then maybe get more and more aggressive about dealing with that resistance from an individual or a group. And that takes a lot of insight and a lot of time and work to determine. So when we're looking at a project for project management purposes, we try to determine to what extent we're going to apply project management techniques to this project. For instance, if you're doing a bathroom remodeling job, you probably don't need a 5,000 activity critical path schedule and earn value calculations. But larger projects require more project management. And the same is true in change management. Depending on the amount of disruption and how many individual employees are going to have their day-to-day lives changed, it's especially true when you talk about benefits or compensation changes. Those need special attention and communication. The one thing that's pretty constant is you want executive sponsorship and leadership in a change. You want to have a consensus among your leadership that the change is good for the organization, and you want to have a communications plan to support the change. So that's almost always needed, regardless of how big or small the change may be. So the best practice for integrating project management and change management is actually to start at the start. Many organizations use change management more like crisis management, and they're very different processes. If you wait for there to be a problem before calling change management in, then it's actually crisis management. The whole idea of change management is to avoid those problems in the first place and have a plan in place to work through whatever comes up in the future. So integration from the start, not a 911 call at the late stages of a project. That's an important way to be successful in the integration process. So what is change management? It's focused on the people side of things. Change management involves individuals, every individual that's going to be affected in the organization, and of course the organizational goals as well. I can't overstate the importance of management and leadership in change management. They have to be, the operations leadership has to be active and trained on how to do a good job in change management and supportive of their organization and the change happening. That can be something as small as a leader decides he's not going to send his people for training. Well, that's kind of a problem. That's going to be a problem for the change overall. Or maybe the leader is supposed to be attending change management meetings and they send a subordinate instead. That sends a bad message to the organization that that leader is not behind the change. Both project management and change management are tools that we use in order to get the realized benefit of a project that we've decided to fund and execute. And so they're complementary, especially when used together throughout the process. There's a couple different structures that people use typically for change management organizations. One, in a projectized organization, they might integrate change management directly with the project management team, which is my preference, versus having a outside office, which is change management, that gets called on as a subject matter expert throughout the project. And then, again, it's best to start early. You don't want to be in crisis management mode. You want to be in project and change management mode throughout. So with that, Lisa, I'm ready to take some questions.
Awesome. So if you guys have questions, go ahead and chat them, and I think that'll be the easiest way for Tim to read them.
Okay.
I think there was a few before, so you might want to scroll up in the chat to see.
Okay. I'm going there now. What are some best practices for resistance management? That's a good question. It's best to get a team together who are actually going to be impacted by the change. Typically, leadership and middle management, get them together and talk about what they perceive the resistance may be that's coming to that is likely to come up, and then what would be a good response to that. So planning ahead of time is definitely a best practice. And having an escalation plan for resistance is also good. Does Pro Sai have some tools to help calculate where each stage of each person is? Yes. One of the great things about the Pro Sai system is that they have templates and questionnaires and sensitivity gauges and really everything you need to do a really quality job executing on change management. So There's a form to help determine an individual's place in the ADKAR process, as well as organizationally, and a tool to determine the impact of a change. So they ask questions like, what percentage of the company will be impacted? Is it a big change or a little change? Will people's pay be impacted? And that kind of tells you where you fall in the spectrum of change. What are some suggestions or tips for convincing management of the need for change management to go along with the project? Boy, that's a great question. It's a tough sell, I've found. And when you look at the numbers, it's so compelling that that you could get much better project results if you were to implement change management. But I think because it's people focused, sometimes it's seen as sort of soft, or like they can't really get a spreadsheet report showing their return on that investment. But I would say the key is to sell your top leadership and choose some projects that are important to the organization to start out with, and really invest in those. Once people see the impact of change management, they're usually converted for good. I know I have been. What about tools to help determine how far in advance you need to engage in change management? Well, that's a good point. One of the most destructive things that can occur in an organization is rumors about an impending change. So the best advice is, as soon as something becomes a likely project or even a possible project that will be discussed more widely, you need to engage change management in that process to determine the best way to approach messaging on that change. Any other questions? Oh, okay. What are some ways to change culture or promote new behavioral changes? Well, cultural changes are tough, obviously, in the organization, in any organization. I think that Pro Sai publishes a little book called ADKAR, which is a great introduction to their concepts and their way of thinking. So I would say, at least in our organization, our leadership tends to share books that we think could have a positive impact on the organization amongst leadership, and that might be a good place to start. What ways to change culture or promote? Oh, that one we answered. I think the PMI question is a question for Lisa to answer.
I don't think I can see that one. So
okay, I'll read it to you.
Yeah.
Is presentation registered with PMI for PDUs?
That it is not.
As the project management lead for PMI within our organization, I can tell you that you could self-report this as an educational project management educational webinar, and you could report the time that you spent on it without it being a registered class. What are the best practices for where to organizationally position change management? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the structure of your organization. A heavily functionally driven organization probably is going to have a hard time matrixing change management people throughout the organization, whereas a projectized or heavily matrixed organization, it would be easier. I think by its nature, change management is better when it's integrated with the project group versus being a separate vertical silo. How do you effectively manage change when you have too many people and departments in your organization making changes at once without your knowledge, proper cross-functional communication? Well, that's very difficult, obviously. And it sounds like you also may be suffering from change saturation, which tends to make everything change run more roughly anyway. So you need clarity from your leadership within the organization. And one of the best ways to help people understand the extent of change would be to put together a survey or a portfolio and demonstrate, look at all this change that's going on in our organization and it's not being well managed. So the business executive side of that is you're investing your resources in these projects, but you're not getting the ROI that you want. And the reason is because we're not managing them well. Any other questions out there? Indeed. Okay, what are the best practices for where to organizationally position PMO office, triggers embedding PMs and functions versus running projects through centralized PMO? I have seen in the last few years a number of organizations actually dismantling their PMOs because the PMOs became more bureaucratic rather than actually helping to execute projects. I think in my experience, PMO, it depends on what the organization is like. For instance, I'm in Seattle and Boeing has a lot of my neighbors work for Boeing. They're a very project-oriented organization. You get on a project to build a new plane, and so they have a PMO, I believe, for each individual project because those projects go on for years and they're very large. So I think it really just depends on the organization. It's hard for a centralized PMO to stay in touch with the entire organization, though. Okay, I've run out of questions, I think. Lisa?
Okay, guys, does anybody have any other questions? If you're typing, we'll give you a little bit of time. I'm probably going to hang out here for another 5 minutes. If you have questions about like the program itself, I'm happy to answer those. And Tim, if you could stay on for like 5 more minutes, and then
no problem.
We'll be good. And I'll send out the slides tomorrow, as well as the survey, so you can let us know what you liked and what you'd like to see us do in the future. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for your time. It was great to be able to share this with you.